This year's McNaughton Lecture is Maina Kiai, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association. It's a great honor and a rare treat, I think you will agree, for the faculty of law to host such a passionate global advocate for human rights and constitutional reform. M. Kiai est un juriste exemplaire formé à Nairobi et Harvard, qui s'est d'abord distingué par une courageuse défense des droits de la personne au Kenya, luttant contre la corruption et l'impunité des autorités responsables de milliers de morts au Kenya en 2008. Avant sa nomination comme rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies, il a dirigé les ONG nationales et internationales ainsi qu'un important think tank à Genève. Depuis 2011, M. Kiai parcourt la planète pour mieux comprendre et faire comprendre les tenants et aboutissants de la liberté d'association et de la liberté de réunion. The task of Special Rapporteur for the United Nations is never an easy one. I want to take a moment here to quote from Mr. Kiai's mandate. His mandate is, quote, some excerpts here, to gather all relevant information, including national practices and experiences relating to the promotion and protection of the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, to study trends, developments, and challenges in relation to the exercise of these rights, and to make recommendations on ways and means to ensure the promotion and protection of the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association in all their manifestations. To incorporate in his report the elaboration of the framework that promote and protect the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. To report on violations, wherever they may occur, on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, as well as discrimination, threats, or use of violence, harassment, persecution, intimidation, or reprisals directed at persons exercising these rights, and to draw the attention of the Council and the High Commissioner to situations of particularly serious concern. Finally, to do all of this in coordination with other mechanisms of the Council, other competent United Nations bodies, human rights treaty bodies, and to take all necessary measures, listen to this, to avoid unnecessary duplication with those mechanisms. If you know anything about the United Nations, you understand that this is in itself, just this paragraph is beyond a human being's capacity. I think I prefer my job to his. Now, the context and manner in which the freedoms of peaceful assembly and freedom of association are exercised today have shifted significantly over a short period. I would say probably a decade, certainly the last decade in particular. There's renewed presence of demonstrations and protests in public space, generally peaceful and sometimes violent. There is also increased repression, use of force by the police, and restrictions to peaceful assembly, even in democratic societies. There's an increased role, power, and significance of civil society, organized crowds, disorganized crowds, in achieving democratic reform in authoritarian countries. And there's an expanding scope for new forms of association, communication, I would say even virtual assembly through social media and new technologies. I know you're all anxious to hear how Mr. Kiai can help us take stock of these converging developments and give shape to these freedoms in a changing world. I know I'm very much looking forward to this lecture. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our 2013 McNaughton Lecturer, Mr. Maina Kiai.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean, and let me also thank Proud and Julia for getting me here to Canada today and to Montreal, and especially to McGill. For many of us from the global south, coming to McGill is a big honor. It's a well-known university, and I'm really delighted to be here. Now, the impetus for this, for the mandate, was the fact that many countries had seen over a number of years that there was shrinking space for civil society. That there had been attacks against civil society across the world, and they felt that the United Nations system needed a mechanism to try and stem that, try and study that, try and highlight that, and that is why this mandate was created. Now, that was in October 2010, and then in January, at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, the famous so-called Arab Spring happened, which then, in a sense, highlighted the issue of freedom of peaceful assembly and made it very clear, very stark, what the challenges were at the global level, and what the dynamics have been since then. So when I started in May 2011, I had these two things to think about, which was shrinking space for civil society and also the context of protest, peaceful protests and assemblies that were gathering on in the world. I must say, because the Dean talked about this, that perhaps for me, this duty, this mandate is one of the best things I've ever done. It's amazingly fruitful, it's amazingly challenging, and I learn every single day. I don't think there's any job in human rights anybody would want to do than be a special rapporteur. And Dean, I think I know enough about the politics of academia to think that your job is not very fun, I must say. But also, one of the things they told me when I started is that I would be spending 20% of my time doing this job, doing the mandate, and the other 80% I could do with my regular work. But I find that actually I spend about 80% of my time on the mandate, and then I have to find another 80% of my time to do my other job. So I have been stretched out, and I have a day that goes almost all the time to 160% of the day. I'm just working. It's just so much to be done. But I do this mandate not just really as an academic intellectual pursuit. I do this job really as a human rights defender myself, as somebody who comes from civil society and somebody who believes in the role of civil society and believes and works in human rights directly where I'm from. So this is, to me, is not an academic pursuit, it's not an intellectual exercise, it's very real, and the things that I speak about and I raise are issues that I live through every single day. And so when I got this chance to come to Canada this time, I jumped at it because I wanted to understand more about what's going on in Canada so that I can be able to understand why the government could react in a way that was quite unexpected. Because I write letters and I communicate to different countries and different governments right across the world, from Cuba to China, to Russia, to Uganda, to Venezuela, and I have begun to notice a trend in terms of responses. Some of them never say a thing, just keep quiet and it stays there. Others write back, and those who write back sometimes condemn us. And then others react and say, thank you for your attention, and we will look into it, and we think there's a point you're making there. I thought that Canadians would fit in that last category of being open to criticism, open to constructive ideas, and engage in a dialogue rather than going onto attack. That's it, something. But nevertheless, I'm open, and I'm keeping that channel of communication with the government of Canada open, and I would like at some point to be able to come back here on an official visit so I can engage directly with the government on some of these issues around the shrinking space, what many or the people today I met were calling the constricting space for civil society in Canada, to see whether, and hear their comments and hear their views about what's going on. Now, a number of things have come up in the last two years and 4 months I've been doing this job. My first report was on best practices for freedom of assembly and association. And in that report, in a sense, I set out the normative framework for what I see as my challenge in the roles of freedom of assembly and association. I would recommend those of you who are interested in this topic to please go and find the report on the website of the Office of High Commissioner. There are a number of things that I think that are quite important. First of all was in terms of freedom of association. We were very clear, and very, very clear, that an association can exist without registration, and that the best practice is to allow societies and organizations to organize and to form without necessarily seeking registration. Now that is at a very formative level. Now, if of course an association wants to seek funds and wants to open a bank account, then there's a place for them to be registered so they can actually do those things like opening a bank account. But for us, the fundamental norm is that you do not need registration to exist. And that was important for us because when you look across the world, there are so many restrictions given to civil society, to associations, before they can form. And I think when you look at the law and the practice across the world, you find that actually when you look at the rights and international covenant of civil and political rights, you do not need to register
to form an association. It may be good for you to register, you don't open a bank account, but you don't need to do that. The second thing we see in terms of freedom of peaceful assembly, the second main thing we said was that in terms of assembly, in peaceful assembly, you do not need to get authorization from the state to be able to do a protest. That you can have a protest that is legal without authorization. What you then might need, though, you might want to notify the authorities so that arrangements can be made for security to make sure that the roads are cleared so you can be able to walk on that, wherever you're doing the protest. But notification rather than authorization is what's important in international law. Now, when I presented my report to the Human Rights Council, that was an issue of great debate from many countries, which thought that you must get authorization. But if you look at the corpus of international law and the corpus of cases that are going on, especially at the European Court of Human Rights, you'll find actually you do not, that the weight is on the sense that you do not need authorization, you need to notify. Now the reason why we put those two major issues was because as time has gone, as we're going on with time, is that many states have become very uncomfortable with citizens protesting. They just don't like the idea of protesting. And we've tried to put that the case for peaceful protest as one, in fact, is not only to the advantage of citizens, but also to the advantage of the state. That any state that wants to know how people are feeling should give them that space to be able to express that. And they may express that sometimes through television, sometimes through writing, and sometimes by being on the streets. And that is fine. That a state that really cares for its people should be able to allow as much space for protesting, for speaking out as it can. And by the way, in case I'm speaking too fast, please just raise your hand. I have a tendency when I get excited to speak fast, so please just raise your hand and I'll slow down. I think those are the fundamental points we wanted to raise in the first report about best practices. But of course, as you look at best practices, you have to look at bad practices as well. And we came across some really, really bad practices in terms of freedom of association and of assembly. And we found that there are many challenges that have been put there. One of the most important ones is, and one of the first ones, one of the earlier ones, was the restrictions on funding to then, of course, I mean, the most important ones are the ones that actually don't allow civil society associations to form. Those are outright bars, and those you can condemn outrightly. But I think governments have become smarter. They don't now just ban you and bar you from forming. They just put restrictions and make it almost impossible for you to organize and to be able to form an association. We've come across instances where you have to have a certain amount of people who are members of an association before you can be allowed to operate. There's nothing under international law that says we have to be more than 2 people to associate. You can associate as 2 people, associate as a million people. It's your choice. The state should never, ever be telling you how you should associate. So we found a lot of cases like that. But we also found now the question of funding becoming a new impediment, a new barrier that has been imposed. And I think the first country to do that was Ethiopia, when in 2009, the government of Ethiopia imposed a fantastic rule called the 10% rule. That if you're working on women's rights, if you're working on children's rights, if you're working on anti-corruption, if you're working on civic education, if you're working on elections, if you're working on, God forbid, human rights, then you can only get 10% of your funding from international sources. The rest, 90%, must be domestic funding, where 70% of its budget is funded from foreign sources. So it doesn't see any contradiction in the fact that its own budget is funded 70% internationally, with NGOs asking for more than 10% of their budget. But to make it even more difficult, what they did is that they said that if you want to have domestic fundraising, you must ask the government for permission. And it takes, I think, 3 weeks or 3 months. You write a letter to them saying we want to have a fundraising event, and then they reply to you 1 week after the date of the fundraising event. They tell you, sorry, you can't have it. Oh yes, you can have it. But the week when you're already late and you have to now go again through the process. The effect of that has been dramatic, and I've got some Ethiopians here who will confirm to you that today there's about only 3 or 4 maximum human rights groups working in Ethiopia, that of doing any sort of work. It has been absolutely, that law has killed off the human rights groups in Ethiopia almost entirely. At that time when it was happening, of course, the service delivery NGOs, the ones that do humanitarian work, the ones that dig the boreholes and give mosquito nets, kept completely quiet and said, we are not part of this, we are safe. However, the Ethiopians had another rule, which then came up. After they finished with the human rights groups, then they brought out the other rule, which had been passed at the same time, which was that you could only have 30%, every NGO can only have 30% of its costs, that are administrative costs. Then you have to show that 70% is programmatic costs. But then they are the ones who define what is programmatic, and they are the ones who define what is administrative. So if you're taking a bus, you're hiring a bus to take mosquito nets from one part of the country to another, and your people who are distributing the mosquito nets, that whole transportation is then deemed to be administrative. Because it's not benefiting anybody. The sum effect has been that even those service delivery groups, those humanitarian groups, those development groups have begun to face challenges as much as the human rights groups. And one of the lessons that I think that's come out of Ethiopia is the real need for all groups that are working in civil society, whether you're service delivery, you're providing legal aid, or you're providing advocacy, or you're doing boreholes, you're digging boreholes, whatever you're doing, you're in this together. And when the state goes for civil society groups, they start off with one and they'll come for you later. That's one of the lessons we have to learn from how the Ethiopian government has dealt with civil society. It's been an effective thing, and now of course it's spread, as we know that in Russia now, there's the whole the whole idea of being registered as foreign agent if you receive any funding from foreign sources. Now, foreign agent, it seems to be a logical thing, and this what's wonderful as well is the fact that the Russians use the Western concepts of it and say, well, in America, if you're going to be lobbying the American government and you're getting money from foreign sources, you must register as a foreign agent. That's true. But if you're registered as a human rights group in the United States of America, you don't register as a foreign agent. It's something distinctly different from lobbying and doing human rights advocacy work. So they're using the American model, in a sense, and twisting it upside down and saying that now anybody who does human rights work, anybody who does monitoring work is a foreign agent because you're receiving some money from the Canadians, if they do that still, or from the Americans, or from the Swedes, or from other people. And it's having a chilling effect. Now, all these issues for me, and all these issues about funding, about registration, and all these things that are coming on, are symptomatic of a larger problem. And that is the fact that governments are getting very, very, very wary of civil society. They're very scared. And I think they should be, to be honest. I think they should be. Because civil society has been the engine of change across the world. And we look back, no matter where we look at it, when we start from the anti-slavery movement, that was civil society groups. When you look at the civil rights movement, that was civil society groups. Getting women the right to vote was always civil society groups. You name it, civil society has been at the engine of change. And I think governments got very, very scared with the Arab Spring and have begun tightening up because they're scared of the change that comes up. But what's fascinating about human history is that every single time a challenge comes up, people find a way around it and are able to continue working and motivating and doing what needs to be done to be able to bring change. And I can't tell you how many wonderfully bright, courageous people I've met from across the world that always inspire me. I happened to be in Dublin about a couple of weeks ago during a meeting of human rights defenders under risk, and a woman stood up from Guatemala and told us how she was shot. She was a labor leader. She was a labor leader trying to fight against a company that was harming workers. She comes to her home. She's with her son. They shoot at her. They beat her up, and then they take off. And she came to Dublin and told us she had a bullet in her body when she spoke to us. And you all start crying because you can't imagine the courage. And she starts saying at the end of it, but I'm not giving up. I'm going to continue. Once I get this bullet out, I'm going to go back and continue the fight. That kind of courage, that kind of determination is so inspiring that no matter how often they shoot, no matter how often they beat people, no matter how often they jail people, the world people don't give up. And they don't give up because you believe in the cause. And I was saying this afternoon, this morning, I think one of the big differences between politicians and civil society activists is that civil society people really believe in what they're doing. Half, I mean, if they're serious, they really believe in what they're doing. They will face it, they will look at it, and they will go at it one way or the other. They find a way around it. And to be honest, and once a civil society body picks up an issue that it believes in, you name it, whether it's about health rights, or it's about housing rights, about evictions, indigenous people's rights, first people's rights, they run with it and they continue and they're determined. Sometimes it takes 30, 40 years, but they don't let go of it because I'm political. And I always say, when I always tell all my colleagues I work with, that one of the beauties about doing human rights work is that I'm not seeking for votes. So I don't mind displeasing people. I don't really mind. It's okay. If you're not happy with it, it's fine. I'm not asking you for your vote. But because I'm not a politician. When you become a politician, then you do care how people look at you. And so you can't take up the difficult issues. And so in contexts like where I come from in Africa, you speak about LGBTI rights and people say, aha, that's it, you're finished. I say, fine, you don't have to like me. I'll still talk about it because it's the right thing to do. Are really about governments being nervous, being scared, being wary of the power of these people who are not seeking elected office, who are not seeking votes, but are committed to a cause, and they want to figure out how do we control these people. Again, for me, it's simple. When I talk to governments, I say, you have two choices. If you don't allow protests, if you don't allow people to speak out, don't allow people to organize, then you're basically chasing them underground. You're chasing them to a place you can't see them, you can't feel them. And that choice sometimes can be very, very dangerous, very negative, can have a lot of impact in societies. And you don't want to do that. You want to have engagement with the citizens that's above board, that you can see, that you can deal with, that you can actually almost anticipate because they're speaking from a place that makes sense. And that's the challenge for governments, because they think that by squashing civil society, because they don't like the idea, they don't like what you speak, they think that they can get away with it and can succeed in getting their voice heard above everybody else. Sometimes it works, and works for a few years, but I tell you, when it goes underground and comes back and bites you where, it can get really, really nasty. So it's really the interest of governments to come out and work on it. Now, a lot of this work, and the other new challenge that is emerging, and for me is on the internet. And this one, I'm raising this because I think it's an important one. The internet is a double-edged sword. I think we have seen how powerful the internet can be in inspiring organizations. And what I say in all my reports is that the freedom of association and assembly must be respected online, offline as it is online. The same rules apply. Now, but one of the things about the internet as well, it being a double-edged sword, is that also governments have also been very, very clever. I met a group of Vietnamese a few years ago, and they told me about this thing they call a 50 Cents Club. And I asked, what do you mean by 50 Cents Club? He says, well, there's a club now in Vietnam that's paid for by the state, that pays each person 50 cents for every negative blog you write about somebody who is fighting for human rights. So people make a life now of just insulting, attacking, and abusing human rights and democracy people on the internet, and it has an impact. I can tell you, when you go on the internet and find that you're being insulted by people, and finding it's 3,000 people have said they don't like you, it can hurt you. It can hurt you. So it's a new technique that's being used, the same way that activists are using the internet and Facebook to organize and to mobilize people. It is being used against civil society activists, and that's part of the fight that's going on, and part of the struggle, I suppose, we all have to go through. But it can't. I don't. And I say this, that I don't mind being insulted on the internet, but I think that I have no hassle with, because again, I'm not looking to be the mayor of this city, but. What becomes difficult is when it becomes threats to your family and to your life, and they come out at you, because that's when it becomes now a very dangerous thing. And I think there is some space and some thinking to be done about how to deal with threats that come through the internet. the company of the internet against people, because a threat, if we take the same line that rights are the same offline as they are online, then we have to also take the same rule that threats that are offline are as important as threats that are online, or vice versa. And that's an issue that we have to discuss. My second report, which I issued, which I issued this year in May at the Human Rights Council, focused a great deal on the funding question, and this one was on the funding for associations. And this one was important because we are trying to make the case that you cannot associate without resources. That even when we come here and on our own free will to meet, there has to be resources. Somebody has to provide the water for me to drink. Somebody has to provide the microphone and the electricity. There has to be some resources that are put into it. So really the right to association is empty without resources. And the reason we're making this case is because of the funding restrictions. And we're trying to make the legal case to produce a norm that says that it is indeed part of the right to association that civil society or associations get not only the right to associate, but the right to seek, receive, and utilize resources. And that includes whether those resources are domestic, foreign, or international. Of course, now a lot of the debates that are going on across the world and in many parts, at least many parts of Africa and in Asia as well, is that if you receive funding from the West, they're calling you a Western agent and a tool of foreign masters. This is what they like to call us often. And I always go back and say that it's funny because the countries that are very much anti-foreign funding are countries that historically have been involved in funding civil society across the world. So when you look at a country like the Soviet Union, the amount of money that it spent on funding civil society organizations, communist parties across the world was immense. When you look at you look at them across the world, there's been a lot of funding by those countries that are now against foreign funding, have been funding historically, and are still funding civil society across the world. So this double speak is something that we are very much opposed to, and we think is wrong. And then we find all these restrictions. One of the things we also raised in the second report on funding is that we would like to see a society, an international community that has the same standard for civil society as it does for private enterprise and corporate interests, as it does have for government. What you find today, there's not a single country that can exist without some form of foreign funding of some sort, whether it's in terms of loans, in terms of investments, in terms of some form of assistance across the world. And you will not find any company that's a big company that won't put its money, won't look for a foreign loan to be able to sustain itself and grow. And so, but you don't find the same restrictions for them as you find for civil society, especially civil society dealing with governance and democracy and development. So we're asking for the same standard that across the world on that issue. The third thing we have dealt with is the issue of freedom of assembly and association in the context of terrorism. And that's something that we're going to be working on a little longer. I'm going to do a specific report at some point in it, because it's an issue that has been used often. And we're seeing labeling of civil society people who are doing democracy work as terrorists. You're seeing people who are doing work, people you don't like are easily labeled as that they're working to help. And you're working as a lawyer, working with people who and with the communities that are accused of being supporters of this issue. You're called a terrorist. So there's an issue that is beginning to work, and NGOs are being checked, and NGOs are being monitored and scrutinized because of this issue. It's an issue that deserves a bit more work, and we'll be adding more work on it because I think it's an issue of concern. Then my next report, which is why I came to Canada, is I'm on my way to New York to present my report to General Assembly, is on freedom of assembly and association in the context of elections. And we chose this because elections are a fundamental, peaceful way of expression, for one. But secondly, it's a fundamental way to the right to public participation in governance. And I feel very strongly that the whole elections dimension has been underplayed internationally. There's a focus very often on the actual voting, going to cast your vote as the central thing, without looking at how the rights are enjoyed before, during, and after. And I think we're finding more and more a lot of what I'm calling now civilian coups that are going on, where incumbents are able to manipulate elections and stay in power and get international approval because they've seemingly done the election day itself well, that we don't look at the activities before and after, and they can present themselves now as legitimate governments. So we think we saw that, we've seen that in many countries. So it's an issue for me that is of concern and which we want to push and pursue a little further. So these are some of the things that we do, and I think that are interesting. Now, I've got to say this because I did a mission to the UK earlier on this year, and one of the things that emerged from that visit, which I raised with the government and it's a public statement and it's in the report that I did, was the question of surveillance by the police in groups. And that was fascinating for me because I just read a little bit about it. But when I met civil society, it became the foremost issue of concern. The fact that particularly environmental protest groups were being surveyed, having surveillance at a level you could not imagine. So much so that they have got this thing called undercover policing, undercover policemen who would actually infiltrate the groups and act as though they're members of the groups. The big case, of course, is known is the one of the guy who was there for 8 years in one of the groups, and he's a policeman, 8 years in the group, working with them, protesting with them. Sometimes he went and incited them to go and do things that were against the law. But for 8 years, they never found any criminal act or intention from that group. The gentleman who was concerned eventually had a number of relationships with some of the members of the group, and eventually had a family with one of them. And eventually, when the police when they thought he had done his job of having enough kids, they pulled him out of the group and left the family just like that. And I found that to be an egregious abuse by the state of these groups. It's an egregious use of resources. The state has absolutely no right to send policemen to groups, and they do what they do, what they did in the UK, and get children, and then when they're tired, they just pull them out and continue like nothing's happened. That's not the role of the state, and I think it's an issue that I've raised with the government of the United Kingdom. I'll keep raising with them because I think it's fundamental. Because I think there needs to be what we call in a judge-led public inquiry on that issue, because it's so important, because they are victims, and this issue of surveillance has gone on and on. And there's a whole culture in the UK that's emerged against these groups, and most of them are environmental groups, and even the naming of them. It's interesting today hearing that in Canada there's apparently beginning the similar labeling of some of these groups as radical extremists. Others are called as not so extremists, but this whole the labeling of groups that they're almost, in fact, that's exactly the same terms they have in the UK. Radical extremist groups, which are then watched and infiltrated, and they get into them. And there's a whole sense that there's a need to stop that. If these groups, because our view is this, as long as these groups are not violent, that whatever they're doing is lawful, leave them alone. If you think they're committing a criminal act, arrest the people concerned and deal with it. In fact, this is how we look at peaceful assembly. That our view is that when you look at an assembly, you look at a protest, if the intention of that protest is peaceful, then it must be treated as a peaceful protest. If some people within that protest decide they are going to be violent, then it's the duty of the state and of the police to identify those people, take them out and arrest them, and let the rest go on with their protest. It has been documented, there's a group in Holland that's been doing this research and says that even at the worst, the most violent protests you find, it's maximum 10% of the group that is violent. 90% of people are not violent when they go to a protest. 90%. Often it's about really 3%. 3% is violent, the rest are peaceful. And the state has the capacity to go in, pick them out, arrest them, and go, and let the rest happen. And it also shows, one of the things it also shows, and just this is evidence that's been researched on, is that the propensity of violence increases with the attitude of the police, the approach of the police. If the police come there heavily armed in a lot of gear and what we call the Ninja Turtle suits and and helmets and tear gas, the likelihood of violence in reaction will always rise. And so there's a real sense in terms of how policing is done to try and change that from this escalation approach to a way that allows people to be non-violent, because most people don't want to be violent when they go to a protest. It's a small minority of people, they're easy to handle, we should deal with it. And that's how the policing is going. So in the same way we're looking at surveillance and infiltration, there's a way in which it can be done that is lawful, that respects the rights of people, and does not create mistrust in the groups. Because the impact now of these undercover policemen in the UK was a weakening of the groups, because there's so little trust now. You don't know who's a police person, you don't know who's going to tell the police anything, you don't know who to trust, because if somebody you're living with, somebody who comes with you to your father's funeral, ends up being a policeman with a different name entirely, and you thought you knew the man, even had a baby with a guy, you don't know him, and the state was paid him to do that. It's a lot of mistrust in society. It's not good for how society should go. So some of these challenges are the emerging threats. But saying all that, I have to get an invitation from the Canadian government, and that also puts an obligation on them to set up meetings with relevant government agencies that I ask for meetings with. And that's useful and very effective and very powerful. I had not, to be honest, considered Canada, to visit Canada officially. But after my day here today, I'm going to be putting a request very soon. I think it's important. And it's important for us, for those of you who, particularly now when you're dissenting, to always think about the reverse. The fact is that in many countries across the world, it is those associations that are dissenting that are not allowed to form. And one of the things, again, we have called for is a parity in how the state treats, for example, pro-government protests and anti-government protests. And across the world, I've never seen any protest that's pro-government ever being affected at all, or being policed or hurt. Never in any country. If you come out today and say, let's bring out 1 million people to support Harper, I can bet you it will be allowed, there will be no policemen anywhere. And that's we say, that should be the standard for everybody. So whether you're pro-Harper, anti-Harper, you're pro this or pro that, doesn't matter. It's a standard of policing and respect for views that is important. What you're trying to encourage is a tolerant world where you can agree to disagree agreeably. You can agree to disagree agreeably. That's what it is. So it's not about the content of those things. And I think on the same issue of, I think if you make a good point about the isolation of dissenters, and I think again it's the challenge for all of us to make sure that if you are dissenting, that you have a family of people around you who will welcome you. And I think that's the challenge. I think again it's really the onus is on us that if there is a social control and social isolation, then you find a way to encourage. And this is not uncommon. I think I come from a country where nowadays if you call yourself an activist, it's like a dirty word, You're an activist. So so we're coming back now to make t-shirts saying, I'm an activist and I'm proud of it. I want to own this word activist. Because it is a good word. Because actually, no change happens in society without activists. None. So own it. So forget isolation is something that they work at us to beat us. And you've got to just take it up and own it and feel that it's the right thing to do. Cambodia is, I have renewed my request to visit Cambodia. And I hope they agree. Sometimes it's almost lucky that this kind of governments don't agree to the requests we make, because I would almost do nothing else but kind of visit country to country, because it's like there's so many countries you need to visit and you have to pace yourself. Okay, but I like to go to Cambodia. Now, when the country doesn't allow me to visit, some countries are interesting. I was in negotiation last year with the government of Malaysia to visit. And they said, yes, of course, you can visit, no problem. We try to fix dates. And I write to them and they say nothing. I go back and say, can we agree on dates? So I visit them at the embassy and say, look, we have to fix dates. Of course, I'll come back to you next week. Nothing. So some governments are very clever. They just don't. They'll tell you in principle we've accepted you to come, but they won't fix a date. And so eventually you know that the yes is a no. We basically say that you don't. My position is that the requirement of authorization is not in conformity at all with international human rights law. That there should not be a requirement of authorization. Notification, we say that it is best practice, because we are trying to see this in the best case. In the best case scenario, you've got a government and an authority that has got some responsibilities in terms of policing, making sure that the traffic is cleared and other things like that. So the notification is to allow the authorities to be able to plan the day so that you have access and can protect you against counter demonstrations and other things like that. So it is, but we also say that spontaneous protests, if peaceful, are valid. So we see how we talk, we say many things we say many things at the same time. But we're very clear that spontaneous protests are valid if they're peaceful. There's a strong push really to say that peaceful protests by their nature are valid whether they're spontaneous or not. But I think they are. I mean, I've talked to enough authorities now who tell me there are real concerns sometimes about how things go. And when a protest happens, and it's a big protest, they do have to scramble like crazy to make sure it's done well. And I'm pretty good friends with a town clerk of Bern in Switzerland, and he tells me stuff that it really does. You do have to understand there are requirements and there are things there, because sometimes windows are broken, you don't know how to do with it. But again, let me also say, in terms of damage caused, if there's damage caused in a protest that's peaceful, that the state should never blame the organizers of it. That the organizers should have no culpability of it. You find the person who threw that stone that broke the window, and you arrest them for it, not the organizers. Now, the reason why a lot of these spontaneous protests are happening is because authorities have begun to blame and to hold organizers responsible for damages that happen. So people say, I don't want to be seen, I don't want to be seen. So you've got to find a way, the state has got to be engaging with the protesters and people who want to express themselves in a way that says that does not put them out there and put them at risk, because then we have this so-called spontaneous demonstrations out there because people just don't want to be responsible. But in every single thing, even with Twitter and Facebook and BBM, there's always an organizing channel that can happen. So if it's useful, I mean, I think for me, the way I see it is that if the state and if the authorities will not hold you, will not blame you, then sometimes it may make sense to be able to have notification, be able to make it smooth. But again, if you come out and all of you and you have 50,000 people, the state can't do anything. Can't stop. It doesn't have 50,000 policemen to put out on the street. So they may try and put 1,000 or 2,000, but it's a big number. And you find the bigger it is, then the harder it is to police. And most times, the more protesters there are, and if there are very many, the police often withdraw. They can't handle it because it becomes very dangerous to them as well. So there's also a real element. It's only the more silly police that then start throwing tear gas and bullets, and they get run over very often by the protesters. They increase the anger and the tensions on that. So I hope I'm answering the question on that. What always thrills me is the courage of these women and men who do this work. I have never seen dedicated people like I've seen who do this human rights work, who do this governance and democracy work, who go against odds to try to achieve it. And I think that to me is the most wonderful thing about it. One of the positives I've seen from my work is when I did a visit to Georgia in 2011, and one of the things I picked out on was a law that had just been passed by the government, by the parliament in Georgia, that was equating work by NGOs in political activity, in political causes, to making those NGOs equivalent to political parties, and therefore with much more restriction as political parties. I raised that issue with the government of Georgia, and it was they changed the law very, very quickly after that, and I think that they had an election, and Georgia was the first country to have a peaceful change of government in the post-Soviet Union states. And I think that there's a lot of issues about the kind of government that's there now. but really the fact there's a peaceful change of party and power is a significant thing in post-Soviet Union. Some of the good things that happened. I think we can't, no matter what we say, we think about the Arab Spring. I remember speaking to some friends of mine from Egypt who are in Tahrir Square, and they said to me in the height of it, saying, the big thing was that, look, we may not succeed with this protest we're doing, but one thing has happened to us, that is, we have lost our fear. We have conquered fear, and fear will never control us again in this country. And true to form, the same people are going on the streets again against Morsi, they're going against the streets often and often. I think fear is the thing that holds us back half the time. And I think no matter what challenges you have in Canada, I don't think many of you fear your government will come and arrest you and disappear you, or come and kill you with ease as they do in other countries. So you have a lot of space in Canada. You should use it, and you should not have that fear. And I think it's something that you've got, and I think you ought to enjoy it and use it, because you have space that other people don't have. So I want to encourage those of you who are interested in freedom of assembly, in causes, on these issues, and I would like very much for me is that there's something. I mean, it is shocking, to be honest, to learn and hear some of the issues I've heard today about the disabling and the constrictive environment that's emerging right now in this country, because it's not something that you normally think of when you think of this country. And I think, but it's also a lesson to us and to the rest of us that sometimes we take freedom for granted, and we think that because it's been nice and been soft and been good, and people think Canadians are nice people, they're generally seen as nice. They're not the Americans, they are polite, they're not aggressive. But I think you don't take it for granted, and I think we have all learned, and we should all know that freedom is hard to get. It's very easy to lose if you're not so careful. Thank you.